Today, our guest is Professor Andreas Spieler from Nottingham University. He's going to speak to us about global capitalism, global war, global crisis. He asks this question: how can these conditions be understood in terms of their internal relationship so as to capture capital's connection to the state's system of uneven and combined development, social reproduction, and the contradictions facing humanity within world ecology? It's a very interesting topic, and we are very grateful to listen to Professor Andreas Spieler. Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot for the invite. Thanks a lot for the nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here for the second time. And as you already indicated, I'm going to talk a bit about this book, Global Capitalism, Global War, Global Crisis, which is co-authored. It's an intensively academic book, so it is very theoretical, but that's not just due to my German background, but it's also to Adam and my long-standing cooperation. So all parts are fully jointly authored, and it started off our collaboration with an interest, a joint interest in theoretical questions of international relations, international political economy. And that book, after over 20 years, is a bit the kind of conclusion what we have come to so far. And the book is divided in three parts. So the first one is the most theoretical, the meta-theoretical, where we establish why we argue that it's important to have a historical materialist approach if you want to understand the economy. The second part then is more thematically focused. We look at the history of how can you understand the emergence of capitalism and the outward expansion. How can we conceptualize the interrelationship between a global economy and an interstate system of sovereign states? Yeah. How do we conceptualize that from a Marxist perspective? And then we also discuss a bit how can we understand class struggle, but in a more expansive way, not just capital employers, but how does that go beyond into the sphere of social reproduction. And again, so the second part in a way links the very theoretical, meta-theoretical part with the third part, which is more on empirical issues. And so we thought, okay, global capitalism, global war, global crisis, and we can't provide, how can we provide some concrete empirical studies without pretending that we're going to cover all the areas of what's happening at the moment in the world. And so this is this kind of post-holding method. So we say, okay, for each of those areas, global capitalism, war, crisis, we are identifying one particular case, so we get them kind of detailed riches in relation to that particular empirical case, but then still allowing us to make some general conclusion about the overall situation on the basis of that case. And so when it comes to global capitalism, we looked at the rise of the BRICS, and here in particular China. When it comes to global war, we looked at the war on Iraq and how we can understand that. And when it comes to global crisis, we looked at the eurozone crisis. And so what I'm suggesting to do this evening is, on the one hand, to engage with the very abstract theoretical, but then also relate that to some aspects on the eurozone crisis related to global crisis, in order to make it a bit clearer what does the kind of very theoretical part allow us then to do when we look at the empirical. Yeah, so there's a purpose of the theoretical. Yes, it's not just a separate part. Yeah, there's a purpose which then allows us to look at the empirical material in a particular way. Hopefully by providing that connection, then it becomes a bit more clear what the purpose is of the book. Okay, so that's good. So I'm first going to talk about this necessarily historical materialist movement. Yeah, why do we need to adopt the Marxist approach if we want to understand what's happening today? I'm going to show how that relates to the issue of agency structure. I'm I'm going to look a bit at what we understand with the material structure of ideology. Rush off. That is no problem. It's sometimes difficult with public transport there too. And then in the fourth, more extensive part, I want to relate some of the kind of conceptual reflections to aspects of the class struggle in the eurozone and the eurozone crisis. Then I'm going to conclude by looking more at the ongoing contestation of neoliberalism. Okay? So let's start with the theoretical part. What do we mean by a necessarily historic materialist moment? And I think in order really to comprehend what is happening at this point in time today, in order to analyze that, we need to understand the historical specificity of capitalism. Yeah, what is it, what is specific about our particular historical epoch? And if you look at how things are discussed within mainstream media, or also by alternative academic approaches, non-Marxist approaches, very often they start by taking the state versus market, the economic versus the political, as the ahistoric starting point. Yeah, so people talk about globalization, but it's all about, okay, what does that mean? Does it mean that states are still the most important actors with authority to organize the global economy? Or do we have now suddenly transnational corporations taking away from states? So you perceive them in a way externally opposite each other. And of course, yeah, you look at it and you think, yeah, that makes absolute sense. That's what correlates with our day-to-day experience, yeah, this separation. But of course, that's in a way, one would say, from a Marxist perspective, it's just the appearance. I mean, there is this appearance for a reason, but it's just the appearance. And so rather than starting our analysis with the appearance, we need to start thinking about why is it that in capitalism the economic and the political appear as two separate areas. Where does that come from? And I think that's also very much what Marx focuses on in Capital Volume 1, where he says, well, if you want to understand why we have this separate appearance, we need to look at how production is organized in capitalism. Yeah, only that allows us to understand the internal relation between the economic and political. And so how is production organized in capitalism, and why is that very specific? To us it appears normal. Yeah? I mean, if you don't own the means of production, we've got to go out and find a job. Yeah? Otherwise, how are we going to survive? So it's very natural. But actually that's very specific to capitalism. Yeah, in feudalism, for example, people would still have owned their own means of production, their particular land, the tools to work the land, and they would live from the produce they generated themselves. Of course, there was also exploitation, but the exploitation was directly political. Yeah, the kind of overlord would come and say, well, if you are here, 20% of your harvest has to be delivered to me. Yeah, so it was political extraction of the surplus. Yeah, that's one particular way. That's very different in capitalism, because in capitalism, nobody forces us to work for a particular employer. And we are free labor. We can move if we don't like it. Fantastic. It couldn't be better. But of course, in capitalism, where you have the organization of production around the private ownership of the means of production and wage labor, those who don't own the means of production, we have to sell our labor power, otherwise we can't survive. And so the exploitation is of course there in the workplace. We create more value than we are paid for in our wage. But the exploitation is not politically enforced. You're not told you have to work here so and so many hours. We look voluntarily for work. And it's this indirect economic way of how exploitation is organized, which then makes the political and the economic appear separate. Yeah, in the political sphere, we are all equal. In the UK, we all have one vote. But of course, we are not actually equal, because depending on our position in the social relations of production, if you are the CEO of a large transnational corporation, you've got much more say. So, but this appearance is due to the way of how production is organized. And that's then why we would argue, well, in order to unravel what's happening now, we need to start with a Marxist analysis, which starts through a focus on the social relations of production. That allows us to grapple with the historical specificity of our particular epoch. And so then we move in the second chapter. Once we've made that argument, we move there, okay, what does that mean for agency structure? Then what does that mean? Who cares about agency structure? We want to look at concrete struggles for social equality. We don't want to look at agency structure. But I think also for activists, it is still important to think about agency structure. It's still important to think about, okay, to what extent are we as agents, as activists, free in choosing what kind of strategies we adopt in our struggles? And to what extent are we driven or limited by the kind of structural conditions within which we find ourselves? So I think it's not just an academic question, but I think also for activists it's a question: how does agency relate to structure? And what does that mean for our possibilities to do something? And what are the limits as a result? So I think it's important. Yeah, it's highly abstract, highly academic, but still actually important beyond the academic sphere. And so I think if you look at it through a Marxist perspective at this problem of agency structure, I think we can first identify the kind of structuring conditions of capitalism. In structuring, I mean, it's things which go back to the structure, not to because of particular individuals and what they want to do. And because, as a Marxist, we start through a focus on the social relations of production, that's then also what we need to do when we look at the structuring conditions of capitalism. And I think the first condition is this enormously competitive, dynamic nature of capitalism. I think that there's no doubt that the way of how capitalism engenders this kind of competitive nature, the kind of outcome of dramatic development with all its negative consequences, but nonetheless is quite dramatic in history. And why would that be? I think we need to go to the way of how production is organized. So as workers, we often compete with each other for jobs. But actually, in capitalism, employers too are constantly in competition with each other. They constantly need to make sure to retain their share in the market, because if they don't, or increase it, if they don't, they go under. And think, for example, about Nokia phones. I think 10, 12 years ago now, they were the absolute global leader. I think 80% of mobile phones were Nokia, hardly to be seen nowadays, not in the handheld mobile market. So that there's competition because of the way of how production is set up around private ownership of means of production and wage labor. There's relentless competition. And it's that competition which makes capitalism so dynamic, because companies constantly have to innovate, constantly have to think about new ways of how to retain and increase their market share. But of course, as a result of that, there's a second structuring condition, and that's this crisis tendency. Because if I, as a company, if I innovate, have a new product, I gain an advantage. Yes, so for me it's good. But that advantage is always only temporary, because other companies need to catch up and potentially overtake, because otherwise they go bust. And so you have more and more produced goods with less and less living labor, because it's often via technological input that you make your products more competitive. And as a result, you end up in this crisis of overproduction, where you don't have enough demand any longer to absorb it, because more and more people are being unemployed and can't spend. Or as David Harvey would say, you have this crisis of over-accumulation. So that there's enormous profits, but they don't any longer find any areas where they can profitably be invested. So capitalism is very competitive, dynamic, but it also has this crisis tendency. And that then leads to the third structuring condition, which is this constant need toward outward expansion. So what do you do in a crisis? Of course you can try and exploit your workers more. That's happening all the time. Of course you can try and destroy some of the production facilities in mergers. Yeah, very often parts of the merged companies are then being dismantled, people made unemployed. But of course you also can gain new markets, or you can enter new areas where you have cheaper labor in order to make yourself competitive. And so, especially in the second part of the book, in chapter 4, we argue that it is really this expansive outward dynamic, which is another structuring condition of capitalism. It's around uneven and combined development. Yeah, these new areas, their development is combined with the initial areas, but it's always also structurally, again, highly uneven. And so we have those structuring conditions, and we would argue if we want to understand the possibilities of agency, we need to keep those limitations, those structuring conditions in mind. Now, let's come to the other side. Let's come to agency, structured agency. And so in capitalism, we would argue there are, of course, because of the way of, again, how production is organized around wage labor and private ownership of the means of production, you've got the opposing social class forces of capital versus labor. But in practice, of course, we all experience that there's no homogeneous working class, nor is there a homogeneous capitalist class. Yeah, there are inner class tensions. And so in the book we outline that in more detail. We need to think about different class fractions. Very often transnational capital, and in particular transnational finance, has a different position from, for example, small and medium-sized manufacturing companies operating more in a particular location in a particular country. So there are different class fractions, and we can identify them. When one does that for empirical research, one always has to make compromises. Yeah, because you could always say, oh no, but it's even more diversified. So unfortunately, when you come then to the empirical research, there's a simplification in there. But I think to some extent we can identify more national class fractions or transnational class fractions, or you can identify finance as a particular class fraction versus industrial capital and labor. So to some extent that's a useful way of dealing with that. And I think importantly, when we think about agency, from a historical materialist perspective now, and in the past I think that wasn't really done, we can no longer just look at the workplace, or here are workers and here are the bosses, the employers. But we also need to see of how capitalist accumulation as a system depends equally, for example, on unpaid labor in the household. So we need to extend to the sphere of social reproduction, and how capitalist accumulation equally depends on constant exploitation of nature, another unpaid source of wealth. And so some people accuse Marxists of all your so reductionists. All the feminist struggles are overlooked, all the environmental struggles are overlooked. So we need to respond to that, and we try to do that in chapter 6 by saying, well, we need to think about how exploitation doesn't just happen in the workplace, but it also happens in the sphere of social reproduction beyond that. Capitalism depends on that. So very theoretical, yeah, but just trying to show a bit how we can think in terms of structure and agency from a necessarily historical materialist kind of perspective, and what that then would set us and help us in relation to when we look, for example, at the eurozone crisis, and I will come back to that at a later stage. Now, the third very theoretical chapter is what we call the material structure of ideology. And there's a wide debate about what do ideas and concepts, in what way do they actually matter. And for example, our colleagues in economics faculties, they still think they are engaged in a search for the truth, of kind of objective knowledge of how the economy apparently works out there. Whereas we make the argument there is no such thing as a kind of an objective knowledge of how the economy works. So we reject the understanding that we could look at ideas as some kind of science, objective science. We equally reject the idea that ideas are simply kind of discourses, that there would be different kind of discourses around Keynesianism, post-Keynesianism, neoliberal economics, and that would nothing have to do with the agency underpinning it. And what we argue instead in that chapter is that we need to understand ideas as an ideology with an underpinning material structure. There are certain discourses, certain economic theories, they are not objective knowledge, but they are actually a reflection and a project perhaps of particular material interests. And then we can perhaps understand better why is it that at some stage suddenly neoliberal economics from the 70s onwards became so dominant, because we can link it back to the kind of material interests underpinning them. And when we look, we can identify how, especially for example, business associations started to fund think tanks who did kind of economic papers on neoliberal economics, on neoclassical economics also called. We can identify how business organizations sponsored economic chairs in economics at universities. So it's a way of how ideas spread. But ideas are underpinned by material interests. And we can only understand ideas when we link them back to the material interests. And again, it's looking at it through a Marxist perspective, the philosophy of internal relations, we call it, that allows us to look at the internal relation between ideas and the material interests. So we don't look at them separately, but there's a very close connection between the two. So that's the theoretical, very abstract, but hopefully, looking now a bit at class struggle in the eurozone, I can a bit give some examples of what the theoretical apparatus allows us then to do in our understanding. So we look at the class struggle in the eurozone in the crisis, and then there are a range of different theories out there which argue that they can explain why we had the eurozone crisis. So I'm not going to mention the idea that all the southern Europeans are lazy. It was of course widely promoted, but we know that's of course ridiculous. The Greeks, for example, worked the longest hours in the European Union. So it's not a matter. So the cultural arguments are on either side. But there are some arguments which argue, well, the main problem is that these peripheral countries such as Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, they just have the wrong institutional setup. They don't have, for example, the right institutions which would avoid wage inflation. There's an argument by some who argue, oh, the Greek workers in the public sector, the moment they were part of the euro, they abused the situation and pressed for too high wage increases, so it's actually their fault. They demanded more when the economy could yield increase, and so now they have to tighten the belt a bit. Or other people would say, well, it's the problem of these countries because their labor markets are not flexible enough, it's too difficult to dismiss people. Or some people say there's a problem with the institutional setup because they are all corrupt. So that's it. Yeah. Easily dismissed. So there's a very narrow focus on a particular national institutional setup. But I would argue in relation to that post-Keynesian, they first of all correctly criticize this institutional focus because they say you can't just look at those individual countries as if they are systems in themselves. Yeah, you can't just explain the eurozone crisis in Greece by looking at Greece as a methodological nationalism. If we think about economics and economic development, we've got to see how is actually the Greek economy integrated in the first instance within the European political economy. How is the Portuguese economy integrated in the European political economy? And so the post-Keynesian, they would say, if you look at Europe as a whole, really the crisis goes back to the way of how economic and monetary union was established in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And they would argue here that, well, in one system, with one interest rate, with one exchange rate, you basically put countries together with very different economies. Yeah, so you put together more export-oriented countries. Germany is often mentioned, but Scandinavian countries, Austria, Netherlands would be very similar, with countries who are more depending on kind of demand-oriented strategies through consumption by citizens. And if you put them together, then suddenly the countries based on demand strategies, in the past Italy or Greece, when they had their own currency, once there were economic problems, they could devalue. And so suddenly by devaluing your own currency, your exports become more attractive. And so you regain a big competitiveness. But actually, once you put them together in the eurozone, where you don't any longer can devalue your currency, then suddenly all you can do in order to be competitive is to make your labor markets more flexible. And so the post-Keynesians, they basically argue that the main problem in the institutional setup of the EMU was that it deprived those countries of their traditional national sovereign policy tools with which to manage competitiveness in the global economy. Yeah, they were artificially put together with very different economic models, and as a result can no longer adjust to the kind of different economic policies across the European political economy. And I think what they also, to their credit, I would argue, what they also do very well is that they say, actually, of course, we tend to blame, or people tend to blame, not us, people tend to blame the countries in the periphery for their problems. But the post-Keynesian point out that actually not just the countries in the periphery relied on the possibility of cheap credit within the eurozone, but actually also the countries with their export-oriented strategies, they also were heavily dependent on other countries absorbing their surpluses. So post-Keynesians point out, correctly I would say, so German export industry made super profits through their exports. What do you do with the money? You have to reinvest. And in the eurozone, reinvesting in state bonds of those peripheral countries seemed to be a safe option to do so. Yeah, so money was then transferred by French and German private banks to Greece, to Portugal, to Spain, to Italy. And then that money in these countries was used to buy yet more products from the export-focused countries. Yeah. So yeah, Greece and Portugal depended heavily on being able to access cheap credit within the eurozone. But actually, Germany, the Netherlands, Austria also depended heavily on those countries doing so and then buying more products from them. And I think post-Keynesians acknowledge that quite properly. I think where we would come, however, from a Marxist perspective and disagree with them is that Adam and I would not argue that it's just linked to the economic and monetary union, but actually that the eurozone crisis is much more fundamentally linked to this uneven and combined development structuring conditions of capitalism. And actually, when we look at the development of Greece and Portugal in the eurozone, and they both joined in the 1980s, and that was of course also the moment when kind of internal market integration was intensified. There was the internal market program in 85, 87, and then we had the economic monetary union from 1991, Maastricht Treaty onwards. So what one can identify, the moment Greece and Portugal joined more closely the European Union and the kind of integrated market, they became subject of this uneven and combined development structuring condition. And basically they became locked into labor-intensive industries. And of course they both joined, it's a fantastic modernization strategies, brilliant. And in Portugal, for example, they said, well, let's establish this new car manufacturing plant. The name of the place escapes me at the moment, but there's a very famous car manufacturer. It's a kind of a cooperation with Ford and VW in Portugal, high-tech, modern workplaces. But when you actually look at what happens there, then you can see all the capital-intensive parts of this car manufacturing are being imported from Germany, from France, from the UK, whereas the more labor-intensive parts of the production of this car manufacturing plant, of putting cars together, they come from Portugal itself. And that shows a bit how these countries become basically locked in, not just because of EMU, but by the very way of how capitalist markets work, in this labor-intensive area. So they can't compete in the sense of productivity with these other countries. They are based in that particular labor-intensive area. And similar when we look at the shoe and textile industries, again there, after integration into the European Union in Portugal, there was an intensification of jobs and work. But again, it was the labor-intensive parts of this shoe production which took place in Portugal, whereas the more capital-intensive, the kind of high-value-added parts, they were done elsewhere. And so, everybody thought in the 90s, oh, how is it possible? It's fantastic. These countries developed enormously within the European Union. That was kind of a liberal development example par excellence. And if we look more closely at it, then we can see how they have become integrated in a way that their development is combined with the rest of the European Union, but it's also highly uneven. They basically get stuck in that low value added, in that labor intensive area. And actually some people argue, if you look at Greece, from the moment they joined the European Union, they became deindustrialized almost in certain areas, because they were just not competitive in the internal market without any kind of state protection with industries in the northern European countries. So when I say that, then some people say, oh yeah, so look here, it's all the fault of the European Union, so they jump as a Brexit argument. But I think that's not the argument I'm going to make. I think it's just in capitalism in general, we have this uneven and combined development condition. And there will always be parts which are being locked into this low labor intensive area, whereas other parts will stay at the high value added capital intensive. And that sometimes can mean that even within one country you have uneven and combined development. In certain countries you may have one sector where that country is at the very top of capital intensive production, but actually the whole rest is more in the labor intensive, low value added sectors. And there's a big discussion, and some people have criticized us for how we deal with China here, because we argue a bit that they are ultimately very much still stuck in the labor-intensive, low-value-added parts of global value chains, and people say that we would underestimate the Chinese potential of developing. That's a question to see how things go. Yeah, it's open-ended, but ultimately we would say this uneven and combined development is structuring condition of capitalism that ultimately underpins the eurozone crisis. And then we need to look at class struggle in the in the eurozone, in particular look at the role of transnational capital and permanent austerity. And so, if you think that uneven combined development underpins really the crisis, then what type of crisis do we have, and how can then capital respond to the crisis? And David Harvey calls this crisis a crisis of overaccumulation. There's plenty of money around, sloshing in the global but also European system, private money, but it's in desperate search for profitable investment opportunities because of this.
Super profitable.
Super profitable, yeah, of course, yeah, the more profitable the better. So it's not a shortage of money, but there's a desperation. Where can you actually invest in? In some transnational corporations, they actually buy up their own shares because they think that's a better investment than laying it out in new production facilities, for example. So there's a crisis of over-accumulation. And the argument is that the crisis in Europe was used by transnational capital to enforce restructuring, which they may not have been able to do otherwise. Yeah, because you could say, well, you are in crisis, and the UK, we know that, the austerity is that this terrible crisis, we are very sorry, but we got to save, yeah, we got to cut back, we can't live any longer as luxuriously. And I think that change you can see in the bailout agreements imposed on countries such as Greece, Portugal, Ireland. But you can also see it in the kind of new European economic governance structure from 2012-13 onwards, where, for example, this rule of balanced budgets has now been institutionalized across the European Union. Yeah, so austerity is also being rolled out across other countries in the European Union. So in this moment of class struggle, it's transnational capital which really comes to the fore and uses the crisis for its own purposes. And we know the austerity policies that have imposed on Greece, employment cuts in the public sector, welfare services cut back, the health services in Greece basically collapsed, education to a large extent too. Countries were forced to nationalize. Water is the only area where Greeks are still successfully resisting when it comes to the water companies of Thessaloniki in Athens. They were asked and forced to deregulate their labor markets, so it's easier to hire and fire people. And we also have instances of cuts in trade union rights. So kind of collective bargaining in Portugal has been significantly undermined. Now, of course, the neoliberal ideology tells us you impose austerity and then the countries will recover. It's a bitter medicine, but ultimately you will recover because you have the increasing competitiveness as a result. And of course, when we look at it, we realize that's not the case. That the situation of large parts of Greece Greek people has not improved. And so people say, oh yeah, it's a case that neoliberal economics has failed. But Adam and I, we would argue in the book, no, it has not failed. It has worked fantastically. It has worked fantastically in the interest of transnational capital. The interest of transnational capital is not to have a functioning health system across Greece. The interest of transnational capital was to find new profitable investment opportunities. So Greek railway system bought up Greek telecommunications bought up, the German Fraport bought up all regional airports. Yeah. They work perfectly. It depends on from what perspective. There comes a bit the material interest of ideas comes into here. You look at that question, and we would argue the crisis and the way the response was managed to the crisis worked extremely well from a transnational capitalist perspective. So let's look more at the material structure of neoliberalism. I think we all know this person. Yeah. So Yanis Varoufakis, a very gifted post-Keynesian economist. Some argue a bit arrogant, but then there are many arrogant academics around. Yeah, so there's nothing particular. But I think, and he's not very well liked in Greece for how he conducted their affairs. And I think it's a good example of what we mean by the material structure of ideology, because he comes from an economics academic background, so he still has the idea that economics is about understanding how the economy works objectively out there. And so he became Greek finance minister. He goes to Brussels, and he expected to attend that meeting of finance ministers and basically give them a lecture on how the economy works. And then he expected Wolfgang Schäuble to turn around and say, oh, actually, thank you very much, Yanis. That's really interesting. Finally, somebody explained to us how the economy works. We realized we made so many mistakes. Thanks for coming along. We are changing our policies. But what he didn't realize at all is that it's not about convincing some others about the objective way of how the economy works. Because this neoliberal economics is deeply rooted in material interests of transnational capital and particular states which host that transnational capital. And of course he banged his head against the wall because there was no reception whatsoever. And he thought, I'm giving them an objective, clear analysis why Greece cannot recover with austerity, and then they just said, we don't care. And so I think what he completely underestimated was the kind of material interests underpinning the ideology of neoliberalism and austerity. He didn't take that into account. If he had, perhaps he would have had to start off by first trying to forge certain alliances with other countries in the EU. I'm not sure whether that would have been successful, but just to think I come there and I lecture them clearly backfired. And that's where we would then say, well, what we really see in the crisis is that the interests of transnational capital have become internalized within the European Union kind of form of state setup and its policies. And I think we can only acknowledge that when we look at this material structure of neoliberalism. And very often, and perhaps we were under the temptation too, assessments then would stop at that point. But that, and many critics pointed out, correctly argue, is rather counterproductive, because if the story stops at this point, then you think, oh, capital is all powerful. There's nothing we can do. And so, of course, when we think about agency and structure and agency, we would argue, how can we understand both aspects? How can we conceptualize both aspects in a situation such as the eurozone crisis? And then there's the idea, well, we need to look at class struggle, because that's where agency and structure comes together. And of course, in class struggle, it's not just capital which is involved, but it's also the side of labor. And so what we do in our chapter 10, the final chapter, is that we look at the ongoing contestation of neoliberalism. Yet even in moments when capital appears to be dominant, and I would argue we are perhaps in a moment of that type, we shouldn't just stop there, but there are always cracks, there are always alternatives, there are always projects which try to go into other directions, often including also transformative potential. And I think for us, if we are interested in more progressive ways forward, it's also those cracks in capitalism's dominance we need to look at and try and understand in the search for alternatives. So capitalist order is always contested. Yeah, we've got to remember that. And if you look then in the eurozone crisis, yes, in a way you could argue Greece has been defeated. In the summer of 2015, the Syriza government, we can discuss for whatever reasons, but they ultimately accepted, even though the majority of the population had argued they are no longer willing to accept austerity. They accepted the imposition of the European Union. So you could say it's over, and most likely in the forthcoming elections, Syriza will be deselected from the Greek government. But nonetheless, even in Greece, there continues to be widespread resistance. So one of the examples would be this worker-occupied factory, EMEK, close to Thessaloniki in the north, where workers have said, no, we don't accept that our company goes bankrupt and all jobs are being lost. We run it ourselves. And of course that, I would argue, is a very small example, but it has a transformative potential. Because suddenly you go beyond this separation of free wage labor and private ownership of the means of production. Yeah, so you actually experiment with a concrete alternative. Healthcare clinics in Greece, yeah, there are lots of healthcare clinics across the countries run by volunteers, helpers, doctors, who basically ensure that a minimum provision of healthcare is still available to everyone, and not just to those who can pay. And these again are very concrete examples of everyday solidarity, where people go against this kind of capitalist exploitative logic. And again, I think that's an example where we can see of how perhaps alternatives can emerge. Water struggles in Europe, very strongly in Italy, but also Greece again. They have this notion of the commons, where they say, well, if we think about how water is being managed, we need to go beyond simply thinking in terms of, we need to nationalize it. We need to go beyond, thinking, it should be run by the private sector. It shouldn't be a commodity, but they say actually it should be dealt with democratically, in a participating way, more at the local, regional level, understanding water as a commons, so jointly owned, but also jointly managed, with the responsibility not to ensure only access for everyone to water now, but also, of course, to make sure that the water resources are secured for future generations. And so thinking about water as a form of commons, again, goes against this idea of private ownership of the means of production, free wage labor, and again shows a bit the kind of potential alternatives there may be to capitalism. And finally, there's ongoing resistance, pension cuts in higher education in the UK, widespread strikes last year. Employers did not expect that. It's not settled yet, who knows what comes, but there is nonetheless an example of successful ongoing struggles. If you think about London, the organization of migrant cleaners, for example, by the United Voices of the World, if you think about the IWGB, what does it stand for? International Workers Great Britain, or
Deliveroo,
the organization of Uber drivers. Yeah, even in sectors which perhaps traditional trade unions would say, you can't organize, it's too difficult. We see forms of workers being organized. So in this moment of class struggle, where agency and structure comes together, we can still see also moments of resistance and signs of potential alternatives. And I finish on that note. Thank you.
Could you tell your name as well?
My name is Burçe. So I was just wondering, well, I was hoping to hear more about war. Maybe you could also talk about that. But I was also, thinking as you were talking, like, what about the state? Where do you put the state within the whole, this structure? Do you think, like, many people think that it's weakened, but many others, I agree with them, the latter, like, they're much more stronger within this entire structure.
Yeah. Would be a couple of questions of whatever you prefer.
Tomorrow, I have to make a 3-minute speech at the anti-Trump demonstration at Boston. Just for information, if you'd like to join us at 2 o'clock. I couldn't decide which subject I should emphasize. And like yourself, wars everywhere, small and big. And because of the money is accumulated everywhere. They are keeping, they were printing money 24 hours a day now, 48 hours a day. And there is not much left. Because buying power of the ordinary people is getting worse and worse. And that's why wars and Trump's type of leaders, populist leaders all over the world, that's why we need to make connections, these developments and the capitalism nowadays.
You mentioned demand strategies of capitalism as well. How it's been created nowadays, and do you think that blockchain and viral adverts are being used some kind of strategies, or do you think that these are the different types of elements in this new system?
The kind of personalized advertisement.
Yeah, I mean the viral adverts, and I was just, first of all, when you were mentioning demand strategies, I was just first of all thinking the blockchain. Is it tool or is it platform? So the viral adverts, how it can be described actually? Can we say that it's being used a kind of demand strategies of this, or is it something else according to your understanding?
Yeah, okay.
This is Benedict notes. Just a few assumptive questions. More of a critique. Are you sort of overestimating the role that technology has in increases in unemployment or decreases in employment? And I assume that when you talk about the differences in class fractions, are you assuming that in organising a class struggle that there should be factions? And wouldn't a sociological Marxism be better than an economic? Because obviously you mentioned that this, the EU is still flush with money, but obviously that money can't buy workers at the lower end any kind of comfort or guarantee that the products that they produce does not guarantee them the money to be able to buy those products. So obviously when we talk about Marx and his political economic theories, and unfortunately some socialists have sort of fouled up that the sort of the translation into the social arena. Do you think a sociological Marxism would be much better than, say, an economic version? Because I understand that Keynes, when I was at Berkeley, they taught us a very basic economic module, and they talk about Keynes, and he believed in each country opening up the markets to the rest of the world. They sell what they're good at, and then they, you get rid of all the tariffs You get rid of all the protectionism that was one of the reasons why the EU was created in the first place, so that nations could basically just sit by and sell what they wanted without being charged tariffs, which unfortunately Trump is trying to bring back for some insane reason. Or there's a question, why can't we just adapt Marxism to a sociological one instead of an economic one? Because it's become too complex, I think, for most workers to understand, and unfortunately, historically, it's become a disaster.
Yeah. Is that a good moment to start responding? I've got some notes there, but just perhaps I start by responding to you first, working my way backward. So when you said it has become too complex for workers to understand, so I'm not sure whether we underestimate workers there. Yeah, I think workers understand quite well the kind of pressures they're exposed in their day-to-day working existence. So I wouldn't underestimate that. But then, of course, then it is a question of what else is available for them to join the kind of dots and see the wider connections of their particular moment where they constantly struggle to make ends meet, where it gets ever more difficult, health services fall away, how to make then a connection from that to the kind of austerity policies. And I think that's perhaps in moments of class struggle when workers come together and explore together that they become aware of that. So I would be skeptical as to say, and then the academic comes and explains the workers how the situation is.
So just one second, because the problem is, from a historical point of view, unfortunately, Marxism, especially after the Russian Revolution, couldn't quite unify these things, and unfortunately, sorry to phrase it in, I'm not implying that workers don't understand it, but the problem is, even if they understand it, it's human nature to come to a different conclusion. So capitalism can exploit these things. So I'll give you an example. In America, the Mitsubishi car plant wanted the trade unions wanted to unionize the workers. Most of them are African American, but considering the history of America, think that African Americans would vote for trade unionism, but they didn't. They chose the Mitsubishi plan, which they got $15 an hour. They got a free, a subsidized car. They got subsidized mortgages.
So why is that?
So how would activists solve that? Of course, it was the trade unions' fault for not unifying black and white workers when they allowed white worker racism. I'm sorry, I know it's complicated, but how would activists be able to intellectually or solve those problems of the past? How would they solve the problems of different groups or different fractions coming to a different conclusion to the same problem, if you know what I mean?
And that's, I think, why precisely we need to think in terms of different fractions and in terms of different fragmentations, for example, along gender and along ethnic, racial lines. Because although you have a broad working class, people who have to sell their labor, that doesn't mean that they're automatically all part of one homogeneous class with a class consciousness endorsing trade unions, for example, in their particular plan. I think often it's used by capital to fragment workers. At the moment, in times of economic recession, that's when xenophobia is being pushed in order to. So you don't look at the bosses who continue to exploit you, but you look at the migrants from Eastern Europe who take your job. These people are the problem. And so just because people are workers class in themselves. Doesn't mean that they are for themselves. And again, that's the moment of class struggle, and there's no automaticity that suddenly black and white workers, for example, would march together. There's no automaticity. It's really the struggle at the workplace, in the communities. And there are positive examples where activists manage to overcome those barriers. And then there are also examples where they didn't. And where the white workers then did say, no, well, we have got our privilege here. We don't want these second-rate human beings to be part of us. There's a straightforward racism, and trade unions have been guilty of that too. And so that's why I think it's important to think it different in terms of fractions and different fragmentations. It's open-ended class struggle which decides those moments, and there's no guarantee.
Would it be best served to undermine those divisions though? Because if they are inventions of a capitalist class, I would much prefer Marxist policy to undermine those divisions, because they're based on erroneous, on pseudoscience and things like that.
Absolutely. So from a progressive strategy would attempt to overcome those and undermine those fragmentations. Do you want to just?
Yes, I'm sorry that I'm cutting. But on this point, I want to make a contribution. This type of struggle going on quite a number of years now, but more and more I am aware that it is not, those struggles are not taken like Andrew putting us now in one book and then we can read. I do appreciate a lot that you put this point and you're putting the finger on it. For example, the migrant, immigrant and refugees are a separate category in this country. I created a migrant trade union group. It was not in the union, outside of the union, in order to bring the migrant workers to understand their rights, shortage of things like language, for example, and to understand the structure of the trade union and prepare their own agenda and put it into the trade union. Trade unions, last time that I mentioned that one, you may remember, trade unions were not happy. They said we are going to put you in the blacklist, and I said, well, I'm going to do it. But at the same time, this is taken over by the Transport and General Workers Union, and they set up their own agenda, negotiate with the GLC and get some monies. Despite that, I got monies and I got workers in this project. This is one example, a small example. There's also black organizations, black solidarity movements organize themselves in a different structure. But the women also constantly, in every single little point, they are exploring and writing books. For example, how the new technology affects the banking workers. I mean, that's just in my mind, but of course very differently. Man goes up, and the feminization of the workforce, the work that occupied by the male, when become the female work, is the wages goes down, and the status is not there anymore. For example, those things are explored. But what is not yet recognized, taking all these beautiful examples and putting it to the main structure, I think that needs to be done, what you are trying to do. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Can we just be careful? First, let the speaker finish the first round of questions. If we want to make any contributions, we can wait until he finishes, all right? Thank you.
Thank you about that. I appreciate that intervention, and there are these initiatives, sometimes inside trade union structures, sometimes in parallel, because the trade union structures are not open for them. And just because somebody is in a trade union doesn't mean the person is very progressive. We probably have all experienced that trade unions can be progressive, can be rather reactionary even. Yeah, trade unions are also a terrain of struggle, and it's open. And so you're right. Sometimes the only way forward is to establish alternative structures, because inside a big bureaucratic trade union, migrants' voices are just not being heard. Yeah. And then sometimes, once the migrant voices become stronger, then suddenly the trade unions open themselves.
Empowered.
Yeah, exactly. So coming to the other question. So how do we deal with the state, and how does that then relate to war? And so even with inside Marxist debates, there's different ways of how you deal with the state. And so there are some colleagues that would speak about the kind of realist moment in Marxism, and they would also have a very state-centric understanding of the international. They would say it's still states who basically decide. Alex Kalinikos, who's also based here, and would be one of those. And we criticize that in the book, I think chapter 5, where we say, well, they also externally put it, so they say there's a two logic. On the one hand, the economic logic, and on the other hand, the state political logic. And so we would contradict that. But we don't go
That's also Harvey's position.
Yeah, and Harvey actually is closely aligned, you're right, with that Kalinikos position. And on the other hand, but we don't go as far as, for example, Bill Robinson, who says the state plays no role any longer. Yeah, there's a transnational state emerging. So what we would argue is that the state is still an important location where capitalist accumulation is organized, and the state plays a role. But we don't say, oh, here's the economy and there's the state, because then we would have this external relation. We look at the internal relation. So we argue, if you analyze a state, you need to see how and to what extent are the interests of transnational capital being internalized in a particular state. So to what extent, for example, is transnational capital and their interest internalized within Britain? And the way this works and the extent to which that is happening may be very different from the Austrian state or from the United States of America. Yeah? So that differs. That's an empirical question then. So the state plays a role, but then it's a question, how are the interests of capital being internalized within that state? So it's not, here comes the big transnational corporation from the outside pushing the state to do something, but it's basically how are the interests of the state being internalized, of the transnational capital being internalized in the state formation itself. And so that's a different way of analytically looking at it. And that then leads me to the question of war, and how can we understand that, the interrelation, the interrelation between the interstate system and the global economy. And so we look at the Iraq war, and in particular we look at the United States and look at how the interests of different class fractions have become internalized within United States policy. And we would argue that when it comes to the Iraq war and the way of how the United States pursued a unilateral strategy, because they didn't get the support of other capitalist countries in the United Nations, so we can see that there was a certain class alliance inside the United States around oil interests, construction interests, arms manufacturing interests, which at that point in time dominated the agenda over more transnational fractions, such as around Apple, the economic giants, and around perhaps Coca-Cola as a global brand, who were much more reluctant and who actually, there are instances where they opposed this unilateral strategy, but in that class struggle they lost out, and that can then explain why the United States went forward. So we understand that, of course, workers are not just one homogeneous actor, but capital is neither. Yeah? There are constant different fractions. It would be interesting to look at what underpins, for example, Trump's trade strategy at the moment. Yeah, I would imagine that companies such as Apple are extremely nervous about the trade war with China because a lot of their products are actually being assembled there. Yeah? Whereas other class fractions which are threatened by Chinese expansion, perhaps involved in 5G technology, yeah, they are quite supportive of this very belligerent strategy. But I would also agree with you, perhaps the biggest threat of Trump at the moment is where you have this crisis of over-accumulation and this search for profitable investment opportunities. How this kind of crisis more and more is being exploited in kind of very belligerent war kind of activities, the way of how he ripped apart, for example, the treaty with Iran, which is a major worry, or how nuclear weapons agreements with Russia are being ripped apart. And that's of course then where there is this danger that this kind of economic crisis spills over into kind of a war scenario. And Trump is one of the key architects there, yeah? playing with fire. Yeah.
So back to this war question. I mean, there are many people who claim that this Iraq war, for instance, did not really bring any sort of material benefits to any of those, particularly oil business, right? I mean, I was just
Did bring or not bring?
Did not bring.
Did not, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, you can't really see a big correlation between war and, from your logic, the transnational capital's interests. So, so this leads me to to Alan Woods' argument, for instance. So, she says there is these wars actually seem to be without any justifiable reason. So when the imperialist capital, so this is a level where you don't really see that only economic force, but the extra economic force comes there just to sustain economic force, right?
So in that chapter on the Iraq war, we also draw on Rosa Luxemburg, and she has this kind of bomb and build strategy, and she would argue that war in certain moments can also be part of an accumulation strategy. You first bomb, and you see whenever the United States engage in war, the shares of arms manufacturer go sky high. They benefit. We see it with the constant weapon supply to Saudi Arabia at the moment, how important war is for continuing capitalist accumulation. But then after the bomb you have to build, because you need to rebuild things. And at least initially, after the end of when did it end? Has it ended? The Iraq war, there were big contracts given out to Bechtel, for example, that construction US transnational corporation in rebuilding the oil industry of Iraq, or in setting up the kind of green zone in.
But was it equal? How much they lost and how much they. I mean, is it justifiable to look at the war?
Yeah.
From this perspective?
I mean, who lost something? I think the arms manufacturer, they gained a lot from the war because they could supply all their bombs, and then the construction company saved a lot. The question then is, what about the kind of other transnational corporations who would have wanted more cooperative efforts with other industrialized nations? I think with hindsight, perhaps we can say it destroyed more. It's certainly from a human factor, if we forget about the capitalist logic, if you think about Islamic State, the rise and the continuation of the war in Syria, it certainly, the costs are much bigger from a non-capitalist kind of perspective. But I think one can argue that this bomb and build is part of capitalist accumulation. and that there is, it doesn't just explain every war, but that it is at least one factor of that dynamic underpinning that. There was also the question about the viral adverts, yeah, and how can we understand that these very aggressive personalized adverts, and that's where all the data collection of Google and so on comes in. And so we haven't tackled that in the book, but I think when you look at Marx, and I know especially Capital Volume 2, so there's always this, okay, there's this sphere of production where value is created by living labor. But then of course that surplus value can only be realized when you can actually also sell the products in the sphere of circulation. And so that's where the distinction between productive and unproductive labor comes to. Unproductive doesn't mean secondary, but unproductive means it's not labor which adds to the value, but which is part to secure that actually the surplus value can be realized. And I think that's where Google and this data collecting comes in. That's unproductive labor, but nonetheless necessary in order to ensure the continuation of accumulation, ensuring that actually products being sold. And these adverts, perhaps it becomes ever more desperate, yeah, to make sure to actually be able to continue with this accumulation process. But you're probably much more an expert in that area, yeah. So
just I was thinking about, because how disturbs people when they are watching something or getting some information. Yeah. So this is another type of tool that capitalism just enters our lives without informing, and it's interruptedly. So that's why I was thinking that it's being seriously used as a tool, but so how they can use it as a demand strategy, because it's been there, and then we are not aware that it's going. You know, you can choose the others, but for that one you're not able to see it. So it suddenly comes into you, and then you have to continue reading or continue watching it. So that's why I was thinking, is it a kind of demand tools?
Demand tools, but demand strategy would normally more associate with kind of Keynesian economic strategy, where you try to make sure that you increase wages, or you have more demand by workers, or you have again someone who can buy up your products. I'm not sure I would call it as a demand strategy, but I think it's more part of this process of realizing the surplus value. How can you make sure to sell your products? And there's a constant change, and that's shopping via the internet instead of going into supermarkets and shopping malls. This changing the way of how capitalism is organized is constantly changing, and it's part of that.
I feel this in regards to war we were talking about, and also what you asked. I don't feel that the only motivation for capitalists to go to war and to utilize Google is self-envy, increase consumerism only. There was a good article in Le Monde English. We were searching Google, now Google is searching us, and then they use the term surveillance state. So it is more going to our lives and control and maybe modify our thoughts to, and as in war, not only demolish and build again, but also the education in that country is affected in a very long term, and people are migrated, being replaced, communities are disintegrated. So it's like demolish the country, but also us.
I think that's a very good reference, and I think perhaps one way of trying to understand this is that perhaps that is a sign of how fragile global capitalism has become, that there is, some people speak about a shift towards authoritarian neoliberalism, but actually by now it's the kind of consensus that neoliberal economics is a good way forward has been more and more challenged. And you can't any longer rely on people just accepting it. There's more and more resistance. And perhaps one way of overcoming it is to have the surveillance state, to be much more authoritarian, to clamp down more violently on resistance. And perhaps that's also then one of the reasons for why that dynamic comes in.
And just a quick thing, talking about your conclusion on capitalism, the capitalist world is always contested. Well, it's a quick question. Because von Clausewitz is considered a realist, where does von Clausewitzian theory come into your? And does it apply to your theories as well? Because he believes that war is politics by other means, and it's also that war is about making your opponent do as you wish.
So we haven't engaged with Clausewitz, and I don't think it's. I would see him as little as I understand of Clausewitz. I would see him more as somebody who just focuses exclusively on the political sphere.
Well, I mean, if it's
externally related.
If it's the markets versus the politics, I'm surprised that you don't think von Clausewitz's theory applies. Is it
he applies to that, to the external connection.
Yeah.
But we would try from a Marxist basis to go beyond it and look at the internal relations and look at why do they appear as separate.
So you don't necessarily believe in the Trinity that he's come up with between government to military and people?
No. Okay. But that's. I mean, I don't wanna discourage the use of it at all. I just think we haven't dealt with it, so we wouldn't see how we can incorporate him usefully in a Marxist analysis. But that's.
But is it because he's considered a realist? I mean, when it comes to the explanation of wars and things like that.
And so in the first chapters we separate ourselves when we speak about the necessarily historic materialist moment. We would engage also briefly though with realists and liberal approaches, and we would outline why we think that they don't have the answer.
Would it be possible just to have a quick explanation why? I mean, I'm just asking if it's not.
It is off the issue.
Okay.
We are. Let's give more discussion to the about the whole topic. Then we can come back.
I apologize.
In one point you mentioned about that we all compete each other, the workers compete each other for work, but also capitalists constantly compete each other because their survival relates with it. I mentioned that because many people who are not Marxist, but capitalism is extremely good and innovate. I mean, people innovate and people do nice things, beautiful technology coming out, and so I think we need to be very careful on that sort of arguments, because when I look at it, the waste, the amount of waste that they produce, like you mentioned about our mobile phones. For example, if I come to your house and my charge is not there, can I borrow yours? And it doesn't go away. And all sorts of things, you name it, they all materials, and when you throw it away, it is also dangerous. They can't be recycled and etc. As well, in the innovation point, maybe let's say we want to innovate something, and immediately we say, okay, let's innovate something. And of course we will think about the market, whether it will, our innovation, our putting the capital will work. And that means, number one, I'm confined with the market demands. Two, I will not think about the human being as human being, how we can develop what we need to develop, and etc. Those are all completely waste brain power as well as material power, and etc. So innovation is very important. Also, innovation is a very interesting topic when you look at it, it confines, impact on the where industrial complexes are setting up.
Yeah.
How do they find the people that they can innovate? How the industry is changed its space and place, as well as the amount of capital is invested in innovation. All these are quite an important part of it. That our argument. Another point I want to ask about you, I'm a bit surprised that you didn't put in the authors' publications section Eugenie Bronislaw-Pashukanis on the theory of general theory of state. Actually, general theory of law.
Yeah.
Because I find his argument is extremely important. That he also says that I didn't do anything really. All I did, I put them anything related with the state and law, what Marx said. But I find extremely eye-opening because he explains about the exchange value and use value and how the state is created and what the state's internal relations are. Yes, I understand that it is on the theoretical level, but still I think we need to use it.
I mean, absolutely responding to that, I mean, we wouldn't claim that we have covered all the relevant literature. There are gaps in the book, and you finish the book and you think, oh God, finally, this is it. And then, of course, the moment you engage with it, you realize it's always a process. Yeah.
That's true.
And other people hopefully pick up some bits and build on it, bringing other relevant authors to the debate. And that's perhaps the maximum one can hope for it. Yeah, and so I fully accept that, and there will be other authors and areas we should have covered. Social reproduction theory, we have it in chapter 6, but I think there is more work to be done. We engage a bit with Jason Moore and his world ecology perspective, but more work could be done there. So
I thought it's called the German debate.
Yeah. So no, I accept that. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Andreas. Always thought-provoking to listen to you. But I was, how shall I say, surprised that you haven't spelled out the word hegemony.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't seen the book, so whether it is in the book or not.
Plenty.
No, but the way you so you talked about the materialist underpinnings of ideas, ideologies, etc., but how they are put into practice, in a sense, necessitates that to the extent that you are talking in terms of ongoing contestations, whether or not it implies possibilities of, in Gramscian terms, counter-hegemonies, etc. Okay, so that was one thing. The other thing is, okay, internal relations, fine. But the way you tended to provide, how shall I say, an additional to post-Keynesian analysis of eurozone crisis, I'm afraid many would find it rather putting forward a very economistic analysis.
Yeah, good point.
And that's why I think it is also important to understand why you have. I just wondered whether you have deliberately omitted a Gramscian sort of dimension to it. But also, in terms of your responses to points made to you, you brought this question of struggle, but in a variety of different ways. And there comes, I think, an important point that one could infer from Gramsci in terms of his, what he called, moments analysis. And link it with the, if you like, Thompson's point in terms of the importance of experience, since you talk in terms of no automaticity. You see, So what do people gain
Yeah.
in terms of their struggles, their experiences?
Mm.
And to what extent, how shall I say, the sort of whatever they gained,
Yeah.
how shall I say, are being maintained
Yeah.
once the experience comes to an end.
Yeah.
That's another aspect of it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I could give a number of examples from the last few years, 10 years or so, of the Turkish example. I don't need to get into it, but the thing is, people may get over their, if you like, prejudices in terms of gender, ethnic, racial, not in the Turkish context, racial maybe, but mezhep, whatever it is.
Denominations.
You know, Alevis versus Sunnis or whatever.
Yeah.
They may, but it wouldn't necessarily imply that what they are involved in a particular context, in a particular struggle, is by definition a class struggle.
Yeah. Okay.
You see? They gain a lot. They become whatever their position is for themselves. But it doesn't necessarily mean, we argued in terms of our brief study on what was known in the Turkish context, 4C tekel workers. That they were working for their rights which were from which they were deprived of, as being identified as some sort of precarious workers within the public sector, etc. And it was celebrated by all of us. Well, the rise of the Turkish working class after decades, etc. Then what happens to them? Deliberately, and there comes the state, what we called a particular strategy of labor containment, dispersing them to a variety of different locations. Why? Because then they would not be in a position to come together and pursue their struggle forward. And it happened. I mean, that's one example. There are many instances of it. So you have to look at it in that sense, in terms of, and does it necessarily mean, per se, an identification of a class, as you said, whether the adjective transnational, whatever, because there could be instances of certain classes, using your terminology, fractions of a dominant class, which may not be necessarily fully agreeing with this particular policy or strategy. So what determines that outcome in a particular moment, since we are talking in terms of moments, is also important. So, I mean, okay, so, but I'm still, agree with you, but how to overcome this distinction which you raise rightfully between economic and, if you like, in Harvey's terms it was territorial logic, but it comes down to the state to the extent that it is identified with the state. It is a problem, especially when it comes to wars and whatever.
Well, everything,
So it is,
trade wars.
for that matter. So particular strategies, yes, but I mean, that's why I said you sounded a bit economistic when you identify transnational capital, underlying everything. So, I mean, thanks anyway for being very thought-provoking.
We should read the book. Maybe you talk about these.
Thanks a lot for the interventions. I think that they are absolutely key. So when it comes to hegemony, I mean, Adams and my so kind of theoretical heritage is within what some refer to as neo-Gramscian literature. Adam would get extremely nervous if he was referred to as a neo-Gramscian nowadays. I don't get nervous. I would still acknowledge the kind of heritage intellectual roots. But what we try in the book is to engage with other relevant kind of Marxist, historical materialist traditions and try to engage productively, criticizing some, so we would distance ourselves from Alex Kalinikos, but trying to incorporate also other insights which we find fruitful in combination with Gramscian understanding. So we draw on uneven and combined development, for example, quite heavily. And so just trying to explore and we would hope develop further a bit. But hegemony does play a strong role. And in these moments of struggle, what is hegemonic struggle? Yeah, and also how is it maintained? And you, of course, successes are never fully assured. They can also be
contested
again. So the class struggle is always open-ended. And very often you have victories, and capital, sometimes through the agency of the state, comes back and reverts those victories. Now, when we think in particular about the role of the state, which you indicated there in that particular Turkish instance, so what we try conceptually is we draw on Gramsci when it comes to the state, and we draw also on Pull and Sass. And so Pull and Sass has this notion of the kind of relative autonomy of the state, where the state sometimes would come in order to ensure that capitalist accumulation in general can be carried on, would also pursue certain strategies which are at the detriment of one particular fraction of capital, but necessary in order to maintain it overall. So we would acknowledge the role of the state also in kind of curbing the power of workers. Now, we speak about that in a general conceptual way, but of course we only have our 3 post-holding case studies, so I wouldn't make any claims concretely, empirically to that case, which I haven't analyzed. You're very right, if the way of how I presented uneven and combined development, you could say, well, that's very economistic. And so we would argue there are destructuring tendencies in capitalism towards uneven and combined development. But we would then also claim that the way of how that plays out in practice depends then on the way of how class struggle unfolds. So that's where the class struggle comes in. And so the particular way of how it unfolds in the eurozone is then also depending on the strategy of transnational capital and how the also to some extent European form of state and its relative autonomy comes into the struggle. Yeah, so we would try to focus on class struggle to bring the structural tendencies together with class agency. Yeah, you're right. So perhaps in my presentation, we're trying to pick out some examples to try to make sense of how particular concepts then inform the empirical. Would have been difficult to do the whole book in that sense. But I think that there's always, and as Marxists we have to be careful that there's always the danger of falling into these economic reductionist arguments. Yeah, and so it's good to guard against that. Yeah, that's why we say we need to focus on class struggle, so it's not economic deterministic. Yeah.
Can I also make a few points? Now, first, it is about the term neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Now, I have just casually listened to Etienne Balibar talking in a Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung meeting in Greece, where everybody talked about neoliberalism, but he said, if you let capitalism have free hands, this is what you see. So neoliberalism is actually pure capitalism. If you don't have, if you don't give any class struggle, if you let them free, that's what you get. So I think he seems more right to me in calling it pure capitalism. This is what they are going to do if you let them. Secondly, in your book you also mentioned somewhere we have to look at the embryo of capital. All the developments later are also inherent in capital. For example, this what you call outward expansion, the tendency to imperialism is inside capitalism. So that is why today, for example, we see plenty of countries, including Turkey, which falls into the definition of imperialist. That is that stage now. So Nigerian, they are also imperialist in a way. So we have to think about this concept of imperialism as well. The other thing is that this the combined and uneven development. In the capital there is always this division of labor. Now when they start, some areas become tourism oriented, for example, some areas become production centers, some areas become centers of trade and so on. First, in a national market, it is, how do you say, concentrated. Then, as it opens, in the case of Greece, for example, I remember in 1960, 69, 65, Greece was a very successful shipbuilding country. There was huge shipbuilding industry. But when the bourgeoisie decided to go into European Union has given Greece a certain certain role in the division of labor. You have sun, you have sea, you have everything. You can be center of tourism. So at the very end, working class becomes a victim of bourgeoisie's own choice. So in a way, this uneven and combined development have shaped today's Greece with the problems. And as the market becomes bigger and bigger, we are going to relieve this division of labor in different sectors all the time. Maybe Portugal, South Spain, all the northern African countries will become more touristic centers, whereas India and China becomes head of master of production with factories, 70,000 workers go and work. They have 11 different types of washing machines being produced and so on. So this is what happens. Now, when it happens, then the role of the nation state itself is also having questions as well. So the global market or transnational capitals market requires certain changes in the legal framework, political framework. Hence we get North African Arab Springs in the Muslim countries, and then the British see what is going to happen. They say, no, we don't want to follow the Germans' tails, we want Brexit. So if you go and ask lots of workers in Stoke, they will tell you, we are of course for Brexit, we take back our control. So nation state resists to higher levels of reorganization of state functions. But at the same time, I think for the first time in history, capitalism creates its own state, which is based on profit making. everything is privatized, contractorized, so you have to give contracts in starting from local governments to war logistics. Whole Iraqi war or American operations in Iraq was organized by private companies, at least in logistics, also in security. What's that company called? This? Yeah, they were privatizing even there. So state functions become much different from what we learned in the school state. That state is in the history. Now we are facing.
That's why it is important to bring in this notion of neoliberalism, which you seem to be
maybe
disputing.
what capitalism was going to have that.
So capitalism undergoes different phases of its own development.
Okay.
Wouldn't neo-colonialism be a better word than imperialism?
Well,
I also agree with that, yeah.
lastly, you mentioned at the conclusion part, you mentioned the cooperatives as sort of option to react. But what we live now is that all the, at least in England, all the labor cooperatives or cooperative-based organizations are being reorganized as profit-making organizations. All co-ops, all housing associations, anything which was common and cooperative becomes market-oriented, profit-oriented. Profit becomes heart of everything. That's very typical. It's nothing unusual in that. Well, that's so far.
So just a couple of responses. So neoliberalism, if we call it pure capitalism, but I would agree, somehow we need to think about different periods within capitalism as a whole. Otherwise, capitalism is just capitalism. I think if we want to understand capitalism, then we need to see the different periods, and perhaps neoliberal capitalism is one way of how we can describe what we witness at the moment. Perhaps there's equally, if you say just pure capitalism, But so I think periodization within capitalism is important. Imperialism, I think it's important to refer to that, but I would speak about neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism, because the way of how that works today is slightly different from the 19th century, when it was really also linked to land conquest and occupation.
And neoliberalism is a post-war phenomenon as well, as a response to the loss of imperial gains, like France from Vietnam, Britain from Africa.
So I agree, but I still think it's good to distinguish it a bit, to see the kind of specificity also within capitalism of different periods. And I also agree what you mentioned with uneven and combined development. I think the importance here is to think, so there's this structural tendency, but then how it plays out in different geographical locations, that depends also on the resistance. And how that is mitigated. So uneven combined development in Asia may be result in very different configuration of class forces than it would be within the European context. But there is this kind of dynamic towards outward expansion. That can be geographical, but it can also be internal. So this kind of privatization of services is one way of expanding the capitalist logic, I would say, to areas which we traditionally would have seen, at least since the end of the Second World War, as outside. So education was for many decades considered a public good. It's not about making profit. The way our universities are now set up, they are profit-making.
Especially here, you know.
In the UK,
I think I came here in 2016. I'm also working at the university teaching. I think this system is the worst. I worked in Canada at McGill. I worked in Istanbul at a private university. I'm now working at Loughborough, and I have seen the worst system ever.
It's quite amazing. I mean, I'm also an active trade unionist. When we read management, they always talk about they're not allowed to talk about profit, they're only allowed about surplus, but they make 33 million surplus, but they don't have money to pay a living wage.
And the other thing is like the reluctance of academics to become, you know, political agents. That's
but that's
well, I think it's worse than Turkey. Here is worse than Turkey.
But that's why it was so surprising last year, don't you think? How many people participated?
I don't know how many people from your department were part of it, but like we've tried a lot to convince people. As, like London is more international, right? So probably, you know, I don't know, maybe people are on visa, that's why they don't want to be part of it, but maybe...
But there's the fear, so some people don't participate because they're worried that they could be outed and then made redundant. Some people are insecure contracts, so perhaps their contract, they're worried that their contracting is renewed. Some people have a stake in that kind of private university. There's quite remunerative career opportunities for academics if you want to become a manager in this privatized university. So there are different reasons why people would not participate. But I still think it was surprising. So we had never had so many picket lines. All entrances were full. We were thinking in the committee, oh God, what do we do? Which entrances are we going to picket? Perhaps we should just do 2 here, 1 here, and there. We've never had a picket, no chance, and all the entrances were picketed all the time. We were completely surprised from the committee. And you would imagine, well, you're the committee, so you have a bit of a feeling what your members are going to do. We were completely surprised by the amount of participation.
May I just bring one more thing? Which I thought it's such a title, you don't normally bring it. And it is quite a trendy topic over the last number of years. The changing nature of capitalism in terms of industrial versus financial. And
financialization
and whether or not it is a plausible and causal, if you like, explanation of crises such as the 2008 crisis, etc.
That's a new theory, though, isn't it? Financialization.
So we draw on it when we would see the global financial crisis as being already in a way rooted in the 1970s in the crisis there, where you had that expansion into financialization to overcome the crisis back then, but in a way to build up a new crisis of a bigger proportion in 2008.
That's also...
And
also in terms of this, what you call this internal or intra-capital, if you like, divisions and struggles and all that.
Well, however, where some people say perhaps that's a bit exaggerated sometimes, because if you look at the big manufacturing transnational corporations, they've all developed their financial arms. You go in Stuttgart, there's the big Mercedes-Benz bank.
Yeah, that's what we argued in the Turkish context. But there is that argument. That's why I said people like Kostas Lagavitsas and who would say that there has been a rather qualitative change, if you like, in the way in which capitalism.
But that's where the post-Keynesians come in, and they say one way of getting to a better situation is to go back to where industrial capital is stronger, and we have more capitalism with a human face when this finance.
Okay, last turns, last questions.
About the cooperative movement.
Because
there was a point, argument about the British corporations, cooperative organizations here. I just want to know whether you mentioned the old cooperative movement like in Mondragon.
Good example.
And it was a good example. So again, we need to look at the historical context. In the historical context, it played a very progressive role there because of the Basque situation. At the same time, I think, as an alternative, organizations, we need to look at communal. When we are arguing about, we don't concretely say we want this. this should be the alternative, because we are not clear.
So thanks for raising that. Apologies, I forgot to respond to that. So looking at cooperatives, again, I mean, that's one of the debates, especially when looking at Mondragon, for example. To what extent can such an experiment, very progressive, survive within the kind of capitalist competition, or does not capitalist competition force ultimately also those cooperatives to adopt certain cost-cutting measures? Yeah, there are examples of Mondragon outsourcing production to cheaper labor locations. So that's important, but I think it's difficult for us to argue, oh, this is what it should be. And I think Marx was always very careful to reject this kind of utopian blueprints, because I think he would have relied more on the capacity of workers in their own area to develop alternatives. And so I don't think that the role of an academic can be, oh, we tell you how your alternative, what it should look like. Perhaps we in our own area, I think at the university, yes, if we organized it in a cooperative way, I think we could do it much better than our capitalist kind of managers do it. So I would know something about perhaps that I could contribute to a collective enterprise within higher education. I can't tell people working at Bombardier in Derby how they should organize their workplace in a non-capitalist way. But people there, I've got a friend working there, they say, we workers, we know exactly what we could do in order to streamline production and make it more efficient. We don't say it, because that would cost jobs. But so I think workers in their own workplace, they will be able to develop their own ways. Yeah, and so it's difficult to say, oh, this is what it should be.
Yes.
My union, Unite, is a progressive union.
Yeah.
I think they are one of those who are very much aware of the need to organize communities.
Yeah.
So they started organizing Unite communities. I haven't seen that the other unions do the same, but the trouble is that Unite also sends you emails about lotteries. Join Unite lottery. So
home insurance.
Home insurance. Home insurance is a very peaceful thing. So it is very contradictory. You have to find your own way, as you say. Militant way, but how?
But we have it in UCU too, that this what are we? Are we a collective fighting union? Or are we a union which provides services to members when they are in difficulty in the workplace? And what's the importance? So our previous General Secretary, I think she always argued we need to strengthen the service function, so when people are in need at the workplace, the union can help. But I think she neglected the kind of collective fighting spirit of the union. So I think trade unions are terrains of class struggle. I think some Unite community areas are very progressive. There are some other parts which are perhaps not so dynamic. There are some very reactionary local branches of Unison in London, for example, the University of London. But again, I think just because somebody is a trade unionist, that doesn't mean that she or he is a very progressive agent.
Any further questions? More contributions?
Thank you.
We are very grateful. Thank you very much.